The rain hadn't stopped in 4 days, and the dead hadn't stopped in 6. I was running east on Route 9 with a woman I'd known for 11 hours, and a boy who hadn't spoken since we pulled him out of that overturned school bus outside of Dayton. My name is Marcus Cole. I was a building inspector for Franklin County before the outbreak turned every structure I'd ever certified into a coffin. The woman was Lena Vasquez, an ER nurse from Mount Carmel East who'd walked out of the hospital after the National Guard pulled back and left the staff to die. The boy told us nothing. Not his name, not his age, nothing. He just followed, gripping a faded Spider-Man backpack like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the planet. We'd been cutting through an industrial stretch south of Columbus when Lena first spotted the drag marks, fresh ones, long smears of something dark against wet asphalt, trailing from a collapsed gas station toward a drainage culvert beneath a rail overpass. The culvert was too small for a vehicle, too deliberate for water runoff. Something had been dragged there, or someone had been dragging themselves. "That's not animal blood," Lena said, crouching. She'd stopped being squeamish around day 2. Nurses adapt fast, or they don't adapt at all. "It's venous, dark, slow bleed." "Could be one of them," I said. "Could be one of us." That was the line that kept getting thinner. One of them, one of us. The infected didn't bleed the same way at first. Their circulation slowed within hours of turning. Something about the pathogen thickening the blood into a tarry paste that clotted in the extremities and kept the core organs sluggishly alive. But in the early stages, fresh ones still bled red, still looked human, still made sounds that could pass for speech. That's how they got close. That's how so many died in the first 48 hours, reaching out to help someone who looked hurt. I told Lena we should keep moving. She agreed but didn't stand up. She was staring past the culvert now, toward a concrete pad half buried in kudzu behind the overpass. It was a slab, maybe 12 feet square, with a steel hatch set into its center. "Marcus," she pointed, "that's a blast door." She was right. I'd seen similar installations during county inspections, old Cold War relics scattered across southern Ohio. Fallout shelters built in the 50s and 60s by paranoid municipalities or wealthy landowners, most of them decommissioned, flooded, or collapsed. But this one was different. The hatch was clean. The welds around the frame were modern, maybe 5 or 10 years old. Someone had maintained this. Someone had reinforced it. The boy moved before either of us could stop him. He walked straight to the hatch and put his hand flat against the steel, pressing down like he was feeling for a heartbeat. Then he looked back at us, with the first expression I'd seen on his face since the bus. It wasn't hope. It was recognition. "He knows this place," Lena whispered. I didn't ask how. I didn't have time. Because behind us, past the gas station wreckage, past the overturned semi that had been blocking the western sightline, something moved. Not one shape. Several. A cluster of silhouettes shuffling around the far corner of the rail overpass, maybe 200 yards out, drawn by sound or scent or whatever neural remnant told their rotting brains that living flesh was nearby. "How many?" Lena asked without turning around. I counted. 7, no 9. 2 more emerged from behind a dumpster. They moved with that fractured gait, shoulders rolling, heads tilting at angles that no intact spine should allow. "Enough," I said. I grabbed the hatch handle. It didn't budge. There was a recessed keypad beneath a rubber weather seal, digits 0 through 9, and a small red LED blinking steadily above it. This door wasn't just sealed. It was locked. And whatever code opened it was nowhere on the surface of the earth that I could see. Lena pulled the boy behind her. "Then we figure it out," she said, "or we die right here." The dead were closing the distance. The rain kept falling, and beneath our feet, something waited. The keypad had 10 digits, and I had no code. That's not a problem you solve. That's a problem that kills you while you're thinking about it. The infected were 200 yards out and closing at their shamble pace, roughly walking speed, which meant we had somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes before they reached us. Try the obvious ones, Lena said, positioning herself between the approaching cluster and the boy. She'd picked up a length of rebar from the rail debris 2 miles back. It wasn't a weapon. It was a gesture, a way to feel less like prey. I punched 1, 2, 3, 4. The LED blinked red. Tried 0000, red again. Then 1962, a common installation year for Cold War shelters, red. Each failed attempt produced a short, accusatory beep that carried across the wet concrete like a dinner bell. "Stop guessing," Lena hissed. "You're ringing the lunch alarm." She was right. 2 of the infected had shifted direction, angling more directly toward us. They were close enough now that I could see details. A man in a UPS uniform, his left arm dangling at an angle that meant the shoulder was dislocated or the tendons had simply rotted through. A woman in hospital scrubs, barefoot, her feet leaving dark prints on the concrete. The others were behind them, a staggered pack, not coordinated but converging. The boy tugged my jacket. I looked down. He was pointing at the hatch frame, specifically at a small engraved plate I'd missed, partially obscured by rust and grime. I wiped it with my thumb. Numbers. Faint, almost worn away, but legible. 7714. "Where did you—" I started. But he was already stepping back, pulling Lena's hand, positioning himself to descend. I punched 7714. The LED turned green. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from inside the hatch, and the steel door released with a hiss of pressurized air. The seal broke, and a gust of stale, climate-controlled air rose from below, cool and chemical, like the inside of a new car mixed with something antiseptic. I hauled the hatch open. A steel ladder descended into fluorescent light. The shelter was powered. Somewhere below, generators were humming. "Go," I told Lena. She didn't hesitate. She swung the boy onto the ladder first, guided his hands to the rungs, and followed immediately. I took one last look at the surface. The UPS driver was 60 yards away. His jaw was working, opening and closing in that mechanical chewing motion they all developed, rehearsing the only function their degraded nervous system still prioritized. Behind him, the woman in scrubs had begun to run. The runners were the worst. Most infected shuffled, their motor cortex too damaged for coordination. But some, especially the fresh ones, retained enough neuromuscular function to sprint. Not fast, not fluid, but relentless, a lurching gallop that covered ground with terrifying persistence. I dropped through the hatch and pulled it shut above me. The locking mechanism engaged automatically with a solid, reassuring thud. I descended the ladder in near darkness for 6 rungs before the fluorescent tubes along the walls provided full visibility. The shaft was roughly 15 feet deep, concrete-lined, with moisture seals at every joint. Whoever built this hadn't been playing at survival. They'd been engineering it. At the bottom, a short corridor opened into a wider space. Lena was already scanning the room with the tactical instinct of someone who'd spent years triaging chaos. The boy stood perfectly still in the center of the space, his backpack on the ground beside him, his eyes fixed on something I hadn't yet processed. The shelter was not empty. A man sat in a bolted-down chair at a metal desk against the far wall. He was thin, gray-haired, mid-60s. His eyes were open. His hands were folded neatly in his lap. On the desk in front of him, was a half-eaten can of peaches, a spiral notebook, and a Beretta 92 pistol. He was dead. Not infected, simply dead. His skin had the waxy pallor of someone who'd passed days ago, maybe a week. No visible wounds, no signs of violence. The pistol was fully loaded. I'd check later. He hadn't used it. Lena approached carefully, pressed 2 fingers to his neck from professional habit, and shook her head. Natural causes. Maybe cardiac. Maybe stroke. He went quiet. The boy walked to the desk, opened the spiral notebook, and placed his small hand flat against the first page. Written there, in careful block letters, "For whoever finds this, the code is 7714. My name is Arthur Voss." This was supposed to be enough. The boy knew the code because it was written in the book, but the book was inside, and the code was also engraved on the hatch frame outside. Arthur had planned for someone to come. He just hadn't planned on being gone when they arrived. We moved Arthur Voss into the shelter's back storage room and covered him with a thermal blanket from the emergency supply rack. Lena handled the body with the professional detachment she'd built over years in the ER. But I noticed her hands trembled slightly when she folded his arms across his chest. The boy watched from the corridor, neither frightened nor indifferent, just observing with an unsettling patience that made him seem older than whatever age he actually was. The shelter was more extensive than I'd expected. The main room was roughly 20 by 30 feet. Poured concrete walls reinforced with steel mesh. A dropped ceiling concealing ventilation ductwork. And industrial-grade LED panels that cast the kind of flat, shadowless light that made everything look clinical. Against the east wall was a workstation with radio equipment. 2 monitors connected to exterior cameras, and a laptop that was still powered on. Its screensaver cycling through default mountain landscapes. Along the west wall, steel shelving units held canned food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, batteries, and ammunition for the Beretta, and a Remington 870 shotgun I found locked in a wall-mounted case with the key still in the lock. North of the main room, a short hallway branched into 3 compartments. 2 were sleeping quarters with military-style cot frames and vacuum-sealed bedding kits. The third was a mechanical room containing a diesel generator, fuel reserves, an air filtration unit, and a water reclamation system that appeared to pull groundwater through a series of carbon and UV filters. The system was running. The fuel gauge showed 60% capacity. "This man was serious," Lena said, opening cabinets in the small galley kitchen tucked into the main room's south corner. Canned goods, freeze-dried meals, protein bars, vitamins. She did a rough count. "There's enough here for 1 person to last 8 months, maybe a year. For 3 of us, we're looking at 3, maybe 4 months if we're disciplined." 4 months. I let that number settle. Outside, the outbreak was 9 days old. The infrastructure had collapsed in 3. The military had retreated behind quarantine lines in 5. Cell networks went dark on day 7. We didn't know how far the infection had spread, whether it was national or global, whether there were safe zones or refugee corridors. We knew nothing except that every hour above ground reduced our life expectancy by half. I sat down at the workstation and studied the exterior cameras. 4 feeds, each showing a different angle of the surface above us. The hatch, the concrete pad, the rail overpass, and a wider view of the industrial road. The infected cluster that had chased us was milling around the hatch area, bumping against each other, pawing at the ground. They couldn't get in. The hatch was rated for blast pressure, and their motor function wasn't sophisticated enough for keypads. But they weren't leaving either. Arthur Voss's notebook was thick, nearly 200 pages filled with meticulous handwriting. I began reading while Lena set up the sleeping quarters and heated a can of soup for the boy. Arthur had been a civil engineer, retired from the Ohio Department of Transportation. He'd built the shelter over 7 years, starting in 2018, using his pension and contracting expertise. He'd been a widower, no children. He'd built it for himself and, as the notebook made clear, for whoever might need it after. The entries started clinical and practical. Inventory lists, system diagnostics, maintenance schedules. But around day 4 of the outbreak, the tone shifted. Arthur began writing about what he was seeing on the cameras. The first infected wandering the industrial road, confused and bleeding from the eyes. Then the larger groups, packs moving with eerie synchronicity. Then the military convoys that passed without stopping, heading south. Then silence. Day 6, Arthur wrote, I am alone in a room designed to keep me alive, and I have never been more frightened. Not of what's outside. I'm frightened that I built this for survival and forgot to build it for purpose. Day 8 was the last entry. His handwriting had deteriorated, the letters shaky and uneven. Heart feels wrong. Pressure in the chest. This is not infection. This is just a body giving out. I'm leaving the code on the exterior frame. If someone comes, they should find the door open. I'm sorry I can't greet them. I closed the notebook and looked at the dead man's chair, still positioned exactly as he'd left it, facing the cameras, watching a world he'd prepared to outlast, but couldn't. Who was he to you? I asked the boy. The boy was eating soup. He looked up. For the first time, something close to communication entered his eyes. He shook his head slowly. Not denial, clarification. He didn't know Arthur Voss. He'd simply seen the code on the hatch. He'd read it, remembered it, and used it. He was maybe 8 years old, and he'd saved our lives by being observant when I was busy panicking. Lena sat down beside me. We should stay, she said, at least until we understand what's happening up there. Outside, on camera 2, the infected pressed their faces against the concrete, like animals sensing warmth through stone. 3 days in the shelter, and the silence had weight. Not the absence of sound, because the generator hummed, and the filtration system cycled, and the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that embedded itself in your skull like a wire. It was the silence of the world above, transmitted through 4 camera feeds that showed nothing but empty road and shifting cloud cover. The infected had wandered away from the hatch on the 2nd day, drawn by something we couldn't see on our limited camera range. For 36 hours, the surface looked almost peaceful, the way a battlefield looks peaceful after everyone is dead. The boy started talking on the morning of the 3rd day. His name was Elijah. He was 9. He'd been on that school bus heading to a field trip at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton when the driver lost control. Probably already infected, probably already turning. The bus rolled twice. Elijah was in the back seat, wearing his seatbelt, because his mother always told him to. And he came out with bruises and a cut on his forehead, while the children around him came out broken. He didn't describe it in those terms. He said, everybody was sleeping and wouldn't wake up. And Lena and I understood what he meant, and we didn't ask for details. Elijah's mother was a teacher in Westerville. His father worked at a Honda plant in Marysville. He didn't know where either of them was. He stated this with the flat, factual precision of a child reciting information for a report. And it was the most devastating thing I'd heard since the outbreak began. Lena and I had established a routine. She managed the supplies, rationing meals with the clinical efficiency of someone accustomed to resource management under pressure. I monitored the cameras and radio, scanning frequencies for any sign of organized communication. Military broadcasts, emergency channels, amateur operators. Mostly static. Occasionally, fragments of voice would surface, garbled transmissions that cut in and out like signals from another planet. On the second night, I caught a clear sentence on a FEMA frequency. All eastern corridors are compromised. Repeat, do not attempt eastern corridors. Then nothing. The radio work gave me something to focus on, which was critical because without tasks, the shelter became a box, and the box became a pressure cooker. 20 by 30 feet is generous for a survival bunker. It is claustrophobic for 3 people trying not to confront the fact that their previous lives have been annihilated. Lena and I hadn't discussed our histories in any depth. She knew I was a building inspector. I knew she was a nurse. We'd exchanged practical information in those first 11 hours on the road. Blood types, allergies, skill sets, the currency of a collapsed world. But personal history felt dangerous, like opening a door to a room full of grief that neither of us could afford to enter. On the third night, after Elijah fell asleep in the smaller bunk room, Lena broke the unspoken moratorium. I had a daughter, she said. She was sitting at the galley table, peeling the label off a can of beans with her thumbnail, a nervous habit I'd already cataloged. Sophia. She was 12. She was at her father's place in Gahana when the infection hit the eastern suburbs. I tried to reach her. I drove for 4 hours through streets that looked like war footage. I got within 2 blocks of the house before a military checkpoint turned me back at gunpoint. Lena, I'm not telling you this for comfort. I'm telling you because I need someone to know she existed, in case I don't make it, in case no one remembers. Her name was Sofia Elena Vasquez. She liked anime and terrible pop music, and she was learning to play the ukulele badly. And she was the best person I've ever known. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't tell her Sophia might still be alive, because I didn't know that. And false hope in this context was a cruelty dressed as kindness. I told her my wife Dana had been in Chicago for a medical conference when communications went dark. I told her about our dog, a one-eyed beagle named Captain, who I'd left with a neighbor when I evacuated and who was almost certainly dead. I told her these things not because they compared to a lost child, but because grief needs witnesses. And in a sealed room underground, we were the only witnesses left. Lena put the can down. You think this is what Arthur Voss felt? This compression, like the walls are getting closer? I think Arthur died because he was alone, I said. And I think he built this place hoping someone wouldn't be. On the monitor behind me, camera 3 flickered. A shape crossed the frame, moving fast, faster than the shuffling infected we'd seen before. It passed through the field of view in less than 2 seconds and was gone. I rewound the footage. The shape was humanoid but wrong. Limbs too long for the torso, movement too fluid for standard infected motor degradation. Something had changed out there. Something was evolving. I watched the footage 17 times. Lena watched it 8. Each viewing deepened the silence between us. The kind of silence that accumulates when 2 people are arriving at the same conclusion and neither wants to speak it first. The shape on camera 3 was not a standard infected. Standard infected moved with degraded coordination, their motor cortex eroded by whatever pathogen was rewriting their neurology. They shambled, they lurched, they occasionally ran in clumsy bursts. This thing moved with a predatory economy, low to the ground, arms sweeping forward with each stride, like a sprinter hitting full extension. Its proportions looked distorted on the grainy feed. But I couldn't tell if that was the camera's wide-angle lens or actual physiological change. Could be a survivor, Lena said. But her voice carried no conviction. Survivors don't move like that. How do you know what survivors look like anymore? She had a point. 9 days into an outbreak that had dismantled every system we relied on, the range of human behavior had expanded into territory none of us had mapped. People were doing things that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. Killing family members who showed symptoms. Burning entire apartment buildings to prevent spread. Running, always running, with the desperate biomechanics of prey animals who'd forgotten they ever stood at the top of any chain. But this wasn't that. The way the figure moved suggested something that had adapted to its new physiology rather than fighting against it. Something that had integrated the changes rather than deteriorating under them. Arthur's notebook offered no guidance. His entries covered the first 8 days, and whatever this was hadn't appeared in his camera range before his death. But he'd included something else in the notebook. A section near the back, separated from his daily entries by a divider tab labeled Comms Log. Arthur had been monitoring the same frequencies I'd been scanning, and he'd been more successful. He'd transcribed fragments of military and scientific communication that painted a more complete picture than anything I'd assembled. Day 3, intercepted from a frequency Arthur identified as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Pathogen exhibits neurotropic characteristics consistent with prion-mediated encephalopathy. Rate of central nervous system colonization exceeds any known model. Recommend immediate reclassification from viral to unknown agent. Day 5, same frequency. Behavioral adaptation observed in subjects beyond 72-hour infection window. Loss of higher cognitive function accompanied by enhanced brainstem and cerebellar activity. Motor reflexes in late-stage subjects exceed baseline human performance by factor of 1.4. Day 6, a different frequency. Civilian, possibly a university researcher. This isn't a virus, it's a restructuring. The pathogen doesn't destroy the host nervous system, it rewires it. We're seeing selective demyelination paired with accelerated axonal growth in motor pathways. These things are getting faster, and I think they're getting smarter. I read the entries aloud to Lena. She absorbed them the way she absorbed all medical information, rapidly, with a clinician's filter that separated signal from noise. Enhanced cerebellar activity means better balance, coordination, spatial processing, she said, sitting on the edge of the desk, arms crossed. If the pathogen is actually restructuring neural pathways rather than just destroying them, then what we're looking at isn't degradation. It's transformation. Into what? Into something optimized for one thing, acquiring new hosts. The implications settled over us like a temperature drop. If the infected were evolving, becoming faster, more coordinated, potentially more tactically aware, then the calculus of survival above ground had shifted dramatically. The shambling hordes we'd outrun on Route 9 were the early model. What we'd seen on camera 3 might be the next iteration. Elijah appeared in the doorway of the bunk room, rubbing his eyes. "I heard you talking about the fast ones," he said. His voice was small but steady. "I saw them before. On the bus before it crashed. The driver wasn't slow like the others. He was fast. He turned the wheel on purpose." The room contracted around that sentence. The driver hadn't lost control. He'd aimed. "Elijah," Lena said carefully, "are you saying the bus driver was already infected when he drove?" "He was making sounds, not words, like clicking, and his neck was moving funny, going side to side really fast. Then he turned the bus into the guardrail. I think he did it because the bus was full of kids. I think he was trying to make more of them. 9 years old. Sitting in the back seat of a school bus. watching a man methodically crash a vehicle full of children because the thing colonizing his nervous system had determined that an enclosed space full of small, vulnerable humans was an optimal infection vector. I looked at Lena. Her face had gone rigid with a fury I recognized, the specific, compressed anger of a mother hearing about children being harmed. She knelt in front of Elijah and put her hands on his shoulders. "You survived because you were smart," she said. "You buckled your seatbelt and you survived. That's not luck. That's you." Elijah nodded. Then he asked if there was more soup. On the monitor behind us, camera 3 remained empty, but the darkness at the edge of the frame seemed to pulse, as if something just beyond the lens was breathing and waiting. On day 5 underground, I discovered the second level. I'd been inspecting the mechanical room, checking fuel lines and filtration seals with the professional reflex of a man whose entire career had been about structural integrity, when I noticed an inconsistency in the floor plan. The shelter's footprint, based on the surface slab, should have been roughly 600 square feet. But when I measured the interior, pacing wall to wall with my hand against the concrete, the total came to just under 500. 100 square feet was unaccounted for. Arthur Voss had been a civil engineer. Civil engineers don't make dimensional errors. They make hidden rooms. I found the seam behind the generator housing, a section of wall that looked identical to the surrounding concrete, but produced a subtly different resonance when I tapped it. The panel was fitted with a recessed handle, nearly invisible, painted the same gray as the wall. I pulled it, and a section swung inward on heavy-duty hinges to reveal a steel staircase descending into darkness. "Lena." I didn't shout. Shouting felt wrong, like it might wake something. She came quickly, Elijah trailing behind her with the backpack he still refused to set down for more than a few minutes at a time. The stairs went down roughly 10 feet, which put the second level about 25 feet below the surface. At the bottom, motion-activated lights flickered on, revealing a space that made me reassess everything I'd understood about Arthur Voss and his intentions. The room was roughly the same dimensions as the main shelter above, but its purpose was entirely different. This wasn't storage or sleeping quarters. It was an operations center. A long table dominated the center, covered with laminated maps of Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Colored pins marked locations, red for infection zones, blue for military installations, green for what appeared to be other shelters or safe houses. The maps were detailed, annotated in Arthur's precise handwriting with distances, route assessments, and danger ratings. Against the far wall, a more sophisticated radio setup than the one above occupied a steel desk. This one included a shortwave transceiver, a signal amplifier, and what looked like a homemade antenna relay system wired through the ceiling, and presumably up to the surface, through a concealed conduit. Next to the radio, a dry erase board was covered with frequency listings, call signs, and time-stamped notes. "He was running a network," Lena said, reading the board. "Look, these are other stations, other people." She was right. The board listed 7 call signs with brief descriptors. Atlas, based in Parkersburg, West Virginia, last contact day 6. Compass, Lima, Ohio, last contact day 5. Ironside, Fort Wayne, Indiana, last contact day 7. Shepherd, Lexington, Kentucky, last contact day 4. Warden, Zanesville, Ohio, last contact day 8. The most recent was Lighthouse, located somewhere Arthur had annotated only as River Junction, with a last contact timestamp of day 8, the day he died. Arthur Voss hadn't just built a shelter. He'd built a node in a survival network, a communication hub designed to connect isolated survivors across the region. The maps, The radio equipment, the meticulous logging. It was all part of a coordinated effort that extended far beyond one retired engineer sitting in a bunker. He must have been planning this for years, I said. Before the outbreak, he saw something coming, or he believed something was possible, and he built infrastructure for it. The question is whether anyone on the other end is still alive, Lena said. I sat at the radio and powered it up. The equipment was higher quality than anything above, military surplus mixed with custom modifications. Arthur had known what he was doing. I tuned to the first frequency on the board, the one assigned to Lighthouse, and keyed the microphone. This is Shelter 7714, broadcasting on assigned frequency. Arthur Voss is deceased. New occupants are present and operational. Requesting contact from any station in the network. Over. Static. Long, hollow static that seemed to contain the ghost of every unanswered call that had ever been transmitted into empty air. I tried again. Same message, different frequency. Warden's channel. Then Atlas. Then Compass. Static, static, static. Elijah sat on the floor near the staircase, drawing something on a blank page he'd torn from Arthur's notebook. He drew with intense concentration, his small hand moving in precise lines. I glanced at the page. He was drawing a map, a surprisingly accurate representation of the Route 9 corridor we'd traveled, with X marks at locations where we'd encountered infected. Elijah, how do you remember all of that? He looked up briefly. I remember everything, he said, and went back to drawing. The radio crackled. A voice, faint but unmistakably human, broke through the static on Lighthouse's frequency. Shelter 7714, this is Lighthouse. Arthur is gone? The voice on the radio belonged to a woman who identified herself only as Lighthouse. Her transmission was fractured by interference, syllables dropping in and out like stones skipping across water. But the core of her message came through with enough clarity to reshape every assumption we'd been operating under. Arthur was the hub, she said. He coordinated supply information, route conditions, infection density reports between all stations. Without him, the network has been fragmenting. Atlas went silent 3 days ago. Compass stopped responding yesterday. I've been broadcasting blind, hoping someone would answer from his station. I keyed the mic. My name is Marcus Cole. I'm here with 2 others, an adult and a child. We found the shelter and Arthur's body. We're operational, but we have no context for the network. Can you brief us? A pause. The static swelled and receded like breathing. Then, the network was Arthur's design. 7 shelters, strategically placed along potential evacuation corridors through the Ohio Valley region. Each one equipped with radio, supplies, and route intelligence. The idea was that when things collapsed, and Arthur was certain they would, the network could coordinate movement of survivors toward extraction points. Extraction to where? That's the problem. The original plan designated 3 military installations as terminal safe zones: Wright-Patterson, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and a National Guard facility near Ashland, Kentucky. As of my last confirmed intelligence 4 days ago, all 3 are either overrun or abandoned. The military pulled back to a new perimeter, and we don't have coordinates. Lena had come down the stairs and was listening, her arms folded, her expression carrying the concentrated focus I'd come to recognize as her processing mode. She leaned toward the mic. This is Lena Vasquez. I'm a nurse. What's the infection status in your area? Bad and getting worse. I'm at a river junction in southeast Ohio, near the Muskingum and Ohio confluence. The infected population here is roughly doubled in the last 48 hours. And the behavioral changes are accelerating. I've observed subjects exhibiting pack coordination. flanking movements, ambush positioning near natural choke points. We've seen something similar on our exterior cameras, I said. Fast movers, different from the initial wave. We're calling them second phase. The pathogen appears to have a developmental cycle. Phase 1 is the initial infection, motor degradation, loss of cognitive function, the shufflers everyone saw in the first few days. Phase 2 begins around 72 hours post-infection. Motor function doesn't just recover, it enhances. Reflexes sharpen. And there's emerging evidence of rudimentary problem solving. They're testing doors, checking windows, remembering entry points. The room felt smaller. 25 feet underground, surrounded by steel and concrete. And the room felt smaller. How do you know all this? Lena asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Because I was a research epidemiologist at the Ohio Department of Health before the collapse. My name is Dr. Maren Schultz. Arthur recruited me into the network 2 years ago. He said he was building something for a rainy day. He had no idea how right he was. Dr. Maren Schultz. The name carried the weight of credentials that mattered now, more than degrees had ever mattered in the old world. An epidemiologist who'd been tracking the outbreak from a scientific framework, rather than just running from it. Maren, what's your supply status? I asked. Sustainable for approximately 6 weeks for one person. I'm alone here. My station partner, a man named Tom Graves, went to the surface 8 days ago to check on a family in a nearby town. He didn't come back. The pattern was becoming familiar. The network had been designed for pairs or small groups at each station. But the outbreak's velocity had torn those groupings apart. People had gone to help others, gone to find family, gone to check on neighbors, and the surface had consumed them. We need to discuss consolidation, Maren said. The remaining stations that may still be active, Ironside in Fort Wayne and Warden in Zanesville, haven't responded to my broadcasts. It's possible their operators are alive but unable or unwilling to transmit. It's also possible they're gone. Either way, the network is collapsing. If we're going to use the infrastructure Arthur built, we need to centralize. You're suggesting we move, I said. I'm suggesting we choose a defensible position with the best resource base and gather there. Your station or mine. And we need to do it before the second phase infected develop the capacity to compromise our shelters. You said they're testing doors. I said they're testing doors. And based on the developmental trajectory I've observed, it won't be long before they start opening them. I looked at Lena. She looked at Elijah, who was still drawing his map on the floor, adding details with methodical precision. Then she looked back at me. We just got here, she said quietly. We just found something safe. Safe has an expiration date, I replied. Arthur knew that. That's why he built a network instead of just a bunker. On the radio, Maren's voice returned. Quieter now, stripped of professional detachment. Marcus, there's something else. Something I haven't been able to confirm, but that I need to share. In my last communication with Atlas before they went dark, their operator reported a sound. A coordinated vocalization from a group of second-phase infected. Not random groaning, a pattern. Repeated, rhythmic. He described it as almost linguistic. The static hissed. Somewhere above us, the dead were learning to speak. We spent the next 48 hours preparing for a decision we hadn't formally made. That's how survival works in practice. You don't sit down and vote on the next move like a committee. You start packing, checking routes, inventorying gear, and at some point, the preparation becomes the decision. Maren's assessment was sound. The shelter Arthur had built was extraordinary, but it was designed as one node in a system, not as a permanent terminus. The fuel supply for the generator would last another 2 to 3 months at current consumption. After that, no power, no filtration, no cameras. We'd be sitting in a dark concrete box with dwindling supplies and no visibility on the surface. Consolidation wasn't just strategic, it was inevitable. The question was direction. Marin Station, lighthouse, was roughly 80 miles southeast, near the river confluence. Getting there meant crossing terrain that included urban fringe zones, agricultural flats with limited cover, and at least 2 bridge crossings over waterways that could serve as natural barriers or natural traps, depending on whether the infected had learned to use geography. I studied Arthur's maps on the lower level, tracing potential routes with a pencil, while Lena inventoried what we could carry. Elijah had finished his hand-drawn map and had begun adding something new. A legend in the corner with symbols for different types of infected. A circle for shufflers, a triangle for runners, a square with a question mark for what he called the thinkers. "Where did you come up with that category?" I asked him. "The bus driver was thinking," Elijah said simply. He looked at us before he turned the wheel. He picked the spot where the guardrail was weakest. He was thinking. I wanted to argue with a 9-year-old's interpretation of a traumatic event. I wanted to attribute it to fear and distortion, and the imprecision of memory under duress. But Marin's reports aligned too closely with what Elijah described. The second phase infected weren't just faster. They were retaining fragments of cognition, enough to make choices, identify vulnerabilities, exploit patterns. Lena returned from inventory with a list written in her precise handwriting. "We can carry enough food for 6 days if we pack light. Water's the issue. We need to plan around sources along the route." Arthur marked several natural springs and rural wells on his maps. "If even half of them are still viable, we can manage." "What about the Beretta and the Remington?" I asked. "I'm bringing both. The shotgun is heavy, but the psychological value is worth the weight. Ammunition is limited, though. 27 rounds for the pistol, 14 shells for the shotgun. That's not a firefight. That's 41 last resorts." She was right. Firearms in this context weren't offensive weapons. They were insurance policies, each round a premium payment against a specific catastrophic event. Every shot fired was a deduction from a finite account that could never be replenished. I contacted Marin on the radio and laid out the proposed route. She had input, specifically regarding a section near the Muskingum River where she'd observed heavy infected concentration near the town of McConnellsville. "The bridge at McConnellsville is impassable," she said. "The infected congregate near water sources. We're not sure why. Possibly residual instinct, possibly the sound attracts them. Either way, crossing the Muskingum there will get you killed. There's a secondary bridge 12 miles north near Malta. Lower traffic area, less population density pre-outbreak, which means fewer infected. That's your crossing point." I marked it on the map. The detour added roughly a day to the journey, pushing our timeline to 5 days if we maintained a pace of approximately 15 miles per day. Achievable but demanding, especially with a 9-year-old. "Elijah," I said, "we're going to have to walk a long way. Are you up for that?" He looked at me with those unnervingly calm eyes. "I walked from the bus to where you found me. That was 7 miles. I counted the mile markers. 7 miles, alone, through an active outbreak zone, at 9 years old, counting mile markers. This child was either remarkably resilient or profoundly dissociated, and I wasn't qualified to determine which. "We leave at dawn," Lena said. It wasn't a suggestion. The cameras show the lowest infected activity in the early morning hours, between 4 and 7 a.m. Whether that's a circadian remnant or a response to light conditions, I don't know, but it's our window. I agreed. We spent the remainder of the day preparing packs, testing equipment, and memorizing the route. I made one final broadcast on the network frequencies, a general call to any surviving station operators, providing our departure timeline and destination. No one responded except Marin, who simply said, "I'll be listening. If you go quiet for more than 12 hours, I'll know." She didn't say what she'd know. She didn't need to. That night, I sat alone at Arthur's desk on the upper level, reading the final pages of his notebook. Near the end, between the system logs and the communication transcripts, Arthur had written something personal, not addressed to anyone in the network, addressed to whoever found the shelter. "I have spent 7 years building a structure designed to preserve life. I have spent 63 years failing to build a life worth preserving. These two facts are not contradictions. They are the same impulse viewed from different angles. What I could not give myself, I could give to strangers. If you are reading this, you are the reason I built it. Not survival in the abstract. You, specifically. The person holding this page. Live." I closed the notebook. In the bunk room, Lena was sleeping with the Beretta within arm's reach. Elijah was curled in the adjacent cot, the Spider-Man backpack tucked against his chest. On the cameras, the surface was dark and still. But I knew it was a stillness that breathed and waited and evolved. We would leave at dawn. We would walk into whatever the world had become. And Arthur's shelter, sealed and humming, would wait in the ground like a seed for someone else who might need a door in the earth. The air hit me first. Not the temperature, which was mid-40s and damp, but the smell. 6 days underground had recalibrated my senses, and the surface announced itself with a complex chemical signature that my brain decoded in layers. Ozone from recent rain, the sweet rot of unprocessed organic decay, diesel fuel from somewhere distant, and underneath it all, a metallic edge that I recognized from Lena's description of advanced infection. The infected exuded a compound through their skin, a byproduct of the pathogen's metabolic processes, that smelled like iron filings and spoiled milk. When you could smell it in open air, they were close. I climbed out first, the Remington slung across my back, and scanned the pre-dawn landscape through the mist that clung to the industrial road like gauze on a wound. The concrete pad around the hatch was empty. The rail overpass loomed overhead, its steel girders beaded with moisture. The collapsed gas station to the west was a dark mass of twisted metal and shattered glass. Nothing moved. Lena came up next, pulling Elijah through the hatch with one hand, the Beretta in the other. She'd fashioned a hip holster from a belt and a leather pouch she'd found in Arthur's supplies, and she carried the pistol with the casual competence of someone who'd grown up in a household where firearms were tools rather than symbols. I hadn't asked about her background with guns. There were many things I hadn't asked. I sealed the hatch behind us, and the keypad's LED shifted from green to red. The shelter would wait. We moved east along the rail line rather than the road. Arthur's maps indicated that the rail corridor offered better sight lines and fewer structural ambush points than the road, which was flanked by commercial buildings and overpasses. The tracks themselves were empty, the last trains having run on day 2 of the outbreak before the rail system shut down entirely. The first mile was uneventful, measured not by mile markers, but by Elijah's quiet counting of the rail ties beneath his feet. He walked between Lena and me, keeping pace without complaint, his eyes scanning the landscape with the same methodical attention he'd applied to his map drawing. He spotted the first infected before either of us did. "Left side, behind the signal box," he whispered. "Shuffler, sitting down." I followed his gaze. 30 yards to our left, slumped against a rail signal junction box, was an infected male. heavy-set, wearing what remained of coveralls, his head lolled forward against his chest, not moving. The infected didn't sleep, as far as anyone knew. But they entered periods of reduced activity, a kind of torpor that conserved energy between active hunting phases. "Keep moving," Lena murmured. "Don't change pace. Don't look at it." We passed. The infected didn't stir. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. By the time the sun had fully risen, filtered through a persistent overcast that seemed to have become the permanent state of the sky, we'd covered 4 miles and encountered 11 more torpid infected at various distances from the rail line. None reacted to our passage. The early morning window Lena had identified was holding, but it wouldn't last. At mile 5, we reached the first decision point, a place where the rail line crossed over a state highway via a bridge. Below the bridge, the highway was a frozen river of abandoned vehicles. Cars and trucks stopped mid-flight, doors open, belongings scattered on asphalt. Some of the vehicles still had occupants. I didn't look closely. The details of what happens to a human body left in a sealed car for 9 days in variable weather are not things that need to be described or remembered. Lena consulted the map. "We need to cross the highway and pick up the secondary road on the south side. Arthur's route takes us through agricultural land for the next 8 miles. Open terrain with farmsteads every mile or so." "Open terrain means visibility in both directions," I said. "We can see them, but they can see us." "Better than being channeled through streets," she replied. "We take the fields." We descended from the rail bridge using an access ladder and picked our way through the vehicle graveyard on the highway. It was here, among the still cars and the silence, that I felt the full weight of what had happened to civilization. Not the violence of it, which I'd already witnessed. The abandonment. People had packed their most valued possessions and driven towards safety, and the road itself had betrayed them. Traffic jams becoming kill zones, vehicles becoming traps. The great American faith in mobility, the belief that you could always drive away from the problem, had collided with the reality that when everyone drives at once, no one moves at all. Elijah walked through the vehicle graveyard without looking left or right, his eyes fixed forward, his count of steps inaudible but visible in the movement of his lips. I recognized what he was doing. He was creating a bubble of numerical certainty around himself, a framework that excluded everything he couldn't process. It was brilliant and heartbreaking. We cleared the highway and entered the agricultural zone. Flat, open, stubbled fields stretching to a gray horizon. A red barn in the middle distance. A grain silo. A farmhouse with a collapsed porch. Normal American landscape, empty of Americans. Lena pointed south. "We follow the fence line. It'll keep us oriented and give us something to put at our back." We walked. The morning deepened. And somewhere behind us, or ahead of us, or all around us in the quiet fields, the new world watched and calculated. We reached the first farmstead at midday. The house was a 2-story colonial with white clapboard siding that had been partially scorched on the eastern face. Someone had tried to burn it, or something had caught fire during a struggle, and the flames had consumed one corner of the structure before the rain put them out. The front door was open. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the gravel driveway, its front wheels still spinning lazily in the wind, which was impossible since no wind was blowing. I stared at it for 5 full seconds before realizing I was seeing motion where there was none. A hallucination of normalcy, my brain populating the world with the physics of before. "We need water," Lena said. Arthur marked a well pump at this property. The well was behind the house, a hand pump model mounted on a concrete pad near a collapsed chicken coop. I tested it while Lena stood watch and Elijah perched on a fence post, like a small, solemn bird. The pump handle was stiff but functional. After 20 strokes, water flowed, cold and clear. Lena tested it with a strip from a water quality kit she'd packed, checking for obvious contamination. Mineral content's high, but it reads clean. Fill everything. We filled 3 canteens and 2 collapsible water bladders. The process took 10 minutes. 10 minutes of exposure in an open yard, with sight lines that extended a quarter mile in every direction. Nothing approached. But the farmhouse bothered me. The open door, the scorch marks, the specific arrangement of objects that suggested interruption rather than departure. I want to check inside, I told Lena. Why? Supplies, information, anything that tells us what moved through here. She considered, then nodded. 3 minutes. Elijah stays with me. You take the shotgun. I approached the house through the kitchen entrance at the back. The door was closed, but unlocked. The kitchen was intact, dishes in the rack, a calendar on the wall showing the month with several dates circled in red. Probably appointments or events from a world that no longer scheduled anything. The refrigerator was running on what must have been a separate generator or solar setup, its compressor humming in the silent house. I opened it. Milk, expired. Vegetables, wilted but not rotten. Leftovers in Tupperware containers, neatly labeled in marker. Dad's meatloaf, Monday. Someone had been living here with the routines of ordinary life intact as recently as a few days ago. The living room told a different story. Furniture was overturned. A window was shattered inward, glass fragments scattered across hardwood floors in a pattern that indicated something had come through from outside. Dark stains on the wood that I didn't examine closely. A landline phone hung off its cradle, emitting no dial tone. On the stairs leading to the second floor, I found a message. Written on the wall in what appeared to be black marker, in large, hasty letters. Martha, gone to Blue Rock. Follow the river. Dale. Dale had left a message for Martha. Whether Martha had received it, whether either of them had made it to Blue Rock. Whether Blue Rock was a town or a landmark or a code word, I didn't know. But the message meant something crucial. As recently as this week, people were still communicating, still planning, still trying to find each other. The human network hadn't fully collapsed. It had just gone underground, into whispered messages and scrawled walls and radio static. I found 3 useful items. A first aid kit more comprehensive than what we'd packed. A topographic map of the county with hand-drawn route annotations. And a box of 12-gauge shells that added 18 rounds to our shotgun supply. I took all 3 and returned to the yard. Anything? Lena asked. People were here recently. Survivors, not infected. They left heading toward something called Blue Rock. Lena frowned. Blue Rock is a village. Tiny. Southeast of here, near the Muskingum. It's roughly on our route. Then maybe we'll find Dale and Martha. Or what's left of them. We moved on. The afternoon stretched ahead of us, flat and gray, the fields giving way to rolling terrain as we angled southeast toward the river valley. The landscape changed gradually, the open agricultural expanses narrowing into wooded hollows and creek beds that offered cover but reduced our visibility. I felt the shift in vulnerability like a physical pressure. The sense of being watched escalating with every narrowing sightline. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, Elijah stopped walking. He didn't say anything. He just stopped, one foot slightly ahead of the other, perfectly still, like a dog catching a scent. Lena and I halted immediately. We'd learned to trust the boy's instincts, which operated on a frequency neither of us could access. "What is it?" I whispered. Elijah's eyes were fixed on a tree line 200 yards ahead, where the terrain dropped into a wooded ravine. He raised his hand slowly and extended 3 fingers. Then he made his triangle symbol, touching his fingertips together. Runners. 3 of them. In the trees. I couldn't see them. Lena couldn't see them. But Elijah's gaze didn't waver, his pupils tracking something in the shadows between the trunks with a precision that made my skin contract. Alternative route? Lena breathed. I checked the map. The ravine was the only crossing point for a mile in either direction. Going around would cost us 3 hours and push us into dusk travel, which Marin had specifically warned against. We go through fast, I said. Stay tight. Don't run until they move. Elijah lowered his hand. They already know we're here, he said. They're waiting to see which way we go. Ambush behavior. Second phase tactics. The dead had learned patience, and patience was the most dangerous weapon in any predator's arsenal. I dropped to one knee and studied the tree line through the gap between 2 fence posts, using them as a frame to narrow my focus. For 30 seconds, I saw nothing. Then, the way a hidden image resolves in a stereogram, the shapes materialized. Not 3, 4. Standing motionless among the trees at staggered intervals, their bodies tilted forward at slight angles, heads cocked to one side in that characteristic listening posture of the second phase infected. They were roughly 40 yards apart from each other, forming a loose arc that covered the most obvious approach path into the ravine. They've set a cordon, Lena said. She dropped beside me and was seeing what I was seeing. That's not random clustering. That's deliberate positioning. How deliberate can they be? Deliberate enough to know that 3 humans walking in a straight line will funnel into the ravine where the ground narrows. Deliberate enough to wait. I felt something I hadn't experienced in the previous 9 days of the outbreak. Not fear, which had become a baseline state so constant it barely registered anymore. Not anger or grief or desperation. What I felt was being outmatched. The sensation of facing an opponent that was operating from a playbook I hadn't read. That was making strategic decisions while we were still treating them as a natural hazard to be avoided, rather than an adversary to be outmaneuvered. We backtrack, I said. We find another crossing. We lose 3 hours. We hit the Muskingum approach in darkness. We hit the ravine now. We might not hit anything ever again. Lena looked at Elijah. The boy was crouched between us, his eyes still locked on the tree line, his body exhibiting a stillness that went beyond mere motionlessness. He seemed to have suppressed even his breathing to reduce his profile. There's a creek bed, Elijah said quietly. Half a mile back. It runs south and connects to the ravine downstream. If we follow the creek, we come into the ravine below them. They're watching the top. They're not watching the bottom. I stared at him. How do you know about the creek bed? I saw it on Mr. Arthur's map, the one in the lower room. I remembered it. He remembered it. A detail from a laminated topographic map he'd glanced at 2 days ago. A minor watercourse that the building inspector who'd been studying those maps for hours, had overlooked. Elijah's memory wasn't just good. It was architectural. He stored spatial information the way some children store dinosaur facts or baseball statistics, with perfect recall and instinctive application. We backtracked, staying low along the fence line until we reached the creek bed Elijah had identified. It was shallow, maybe ankle deep, running through a muddy channel carved into clay soil. We dropped into it and followed its course south, bent at the waist, the creek banks providing roughly 3 feet of concealment on either side. The water was cold, and the footing was treacherous, slippery clay over rock. And twice I nearly lost my balance and had to grab the bank to steady myself. The creek wound through a series of gentle curves before the banks deepened and the channel widened into the ravine's lower section. Here, the tree canopy thickened overhead, cutting the already dim daylight to a perpetual twilight. I could hear the ravine's main drainage stream ahead, the sound of moving water providing natural noise cover. Lena tapped my shoulder and pointed upslope. Through the trees, perhaps 80 yards above and to our left, I could see one of the second phase infected, still standing in its sentinel posture, facing north, watching the approach we hadn't taken. Its back was to us. Its body was utterly still, displaying a patience that no first phase infected could have maintained, the patience of a predator confident in its positioning. We moved downstream. Single file, Lena, then Elijah, then me, walking backward with the Remington's barrel pointed up the slope. My boots made soft sucking sounds in the mud that seemed catastrophically loud in the ravine's acoustic chamber. It took 22 minutes to traverse the ravine from the creek bed entrance to the southern exit point, where the terrain opened into a wide floodplain bordering the first agricultural fields south of the Muskingum approach. 22 minutes of controlled breathing and deliberate footsteps, and the knowledge that 80 yards above us, 4 evolved predators were waiting for prey that had chosen a different path. We emerged from the ravine's mouth and crossed the floodplain at a pace just short of jogging, putting distance between ourselves and the tree line before the infected could reorient. I kept checking behind us. Nothing followed. The cordon held its position, committed to a strategy that we'd circumvented through the spatial memory of a 9-year-old boy. When we'd put a full mile between us and the ravine, Lena stopped and knelt beside Elijah. She didn't say thank you. She didn't comment on what he'd done. She simply put her forehead against his and breathed. And he stood perfectly still and let her. And for a moment, in that gray field, the 3 of us were something more than survivors. We were becoming a unit, something Arthur Voss had understood when he built his network. Survival wasn't a structure you reinforced. It was a relationship you maintained. The Muskingum River appeared on the horizon as a dark line cutting through the terrain. Behind it, somewhere in the fading afternoon light, Marin was listening on her radio, waiting for our signal. I keyed the handheld transceiver we'd taken from the shelter. Lighthouse, this is Marcus. We're approaching the river, approximately 8 miles from the Malta crossing. We've encountered second phase infected with coordinated ambush behavior. Confirm your area status. The response came immediately, as if she'd been holding the mic. Marcus, do not approach Malta after dark. Repeat, do not approach after dark. The bridge is clear as of this morning, but the west bank has an active cluster. 20+ mixed phase. You need daylight for this crossing. I looked at the sky. 2 hours of light remaining. 8 miles to Malta. The math was possible, but not forgiving. We push, I said to Lena. She adjusted her pack straps and took Elijah's hand. Then we push. We reached the outskirts of Malta at dusk, which was not daylight and not darkness, but a treacherous liminal zone, where shapes became suggestions and distances collapsed into ambiguity. The town was small, barely a cluster of buildings arranged along a main street that terminated at the Muskingum River Bridge, a 2-lane steel truss structure spanning perhaps 150 yards of dark, slow-moving water. Marin's warning about the West Bank cluster was visible even from our approach angle. On the far side of the bridge, extending south along the riverbank, figures moved in the gathering dark. Not individual wanderers, a mass. They shifted and eddied like a single organism, occasionally separating into smaller groups before reconverging, driven by impulses that followed a logic we couldn't decode. 20+ was conservative. Lena said, counting through the binoculars we'd taken from Arthur's supplies. I'm seeing at least 40. Mixed phase, like she said. Shufflers on the periphery. Faster ones moving through the center. Can we cross without drawing them? The bridge is open. No cover. If any of them are watching the crossing point, which they probably are given the ambush behavior we just saw, they'll intercept us before we reach the far side. I keyed the radio. Marin, we're at the Malta approach. The cluster is larger than your morning count. We need an alternative. Her response was tense. There is no alternative within a day's walk. The next bridge north is at Rokeby Lock, 18 miles upstream. The one south at McConnellsville is out of the question. Malta is your crossing. Then we need a distraction. Silence. Then, I can provide one. But it requires timing, and it requires you to move faster than you've ever moved in your lives. Marin explained her plan. She had access to a repeater station, part of Arthur's network infrastructure, mounted on a cell tower approximately half a mile south of the bridge on the east bank. The repeater could broadcast a high-frequency tone that, based on her observations, provoked a strong orienting response in infected of all phases. Something about the frequency triggered their auditory processing, possibly related to the pathogen's effect on the superior olivary complex, and they would move toward the source with single-minded intensity. When I activate the repeater, the cluster will shift south toward the tower. You'll have a window. Based on previous tests, the window is approximately 3 to 4 minutes before the signal's novelty wears off and they begin to disperse. You need to be across the bridge and into cover on the east bank before that window closes. Previous tests, I repeated. You've done this before. Twice. Once to clear a supply route. Once to recover Tom's vehicle after he didn't come back. Both times the infected responded predictably. But both times were with smaller groups and during daylight. I can't guarantee the same response in darkness with a cluster this size. Lena looked at me. I looked at Elijah. The boy was sitting on a guardrail at the road's edge, his feet dangling, watching the distant cluster with what I had come to think of as his cartographic gaze. The expression he wore when he was committing spatial information to that remarkable internal database. The bridge has a maintenance walkway underneath, Elijah said. I can see the access ladder from here. Third piling from this end. I followed his gaze. He was right. Beneath the main deck of the truss bridge, a narrow catwalk ran along the underside, used by maintenance crews for inspections. It was exposed and precarious, barely 3 feet wide with open sides above the water. But it was below the sight line of anything standing on the bridge deck or the riverbanks. We go under, I said. While the distraction pulls the main cluster south, we cross on the maintenance catwalk. Lower profile, below their visual plane. Lena assessed the catwalk through the binoculars. It's intact but narrow. One person at a time. Elijah first, he's lightest. Me second. You last with the shotgun. If they spot us on the catwalk, we're trapped over water with no cover and no retreat. If they spot us on the bridge deck, same outcome but 30 feet higher. At least on the catwalk, we might be below their detection threshold. She was right. The infected, particularly the second phase, appeared to orient primarily through auditory and olfactory cues, with visual tracking that prioritized horizontal plane movement, the kind of scanning you'd expect from a predator adapted to pursuing prey on level ground. A target moving below the bridge surface, masked by the sound of the river and the wind through the truss structure, had a better chance of passing unnoticed. I radioed Marin. Change of approach. We're using the maintenance catwalk beneath the bridge. Activate the repeater on my signal. We'll need the full 4-minute window. Understood. Standing by. We moved to the access ladder. The bridge's first piling rose from the riverbank's edge, its concrete base slick with moisture and algae. The ladder was steel, bolted to the piling, and descended to the catwalk level, approximately 10 feet below the road's surface. Elijah climbed over the guardrail and descended the ladder without hesitation. I watched his small hands grip each rung with practiced certainty, and I wondered what it cost him internally to project such calm. Whether his silence over those first days had been shock or strategy, a way of conserving emotional energy for moments exactly like this. Lena followed. I stood at the guardrail and keyed the radio. Marin, now. 3 seconds of silence. Then, from somewhere south along the river, a piercing tone split the air, a frequency that I felt in my sinuses and the back of my jaw, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the bones of the skull. On the far bank, the cluster responded. Heads turned south in near unison, bodies pivoted, and then they moved, dozens of them, flowing south along the riverbank toward the repeater tower, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. I went over the guardrail and down the ladder into darkness and the sound of water. The catwalk was worse than it looked from above. Steel grating, corroded at the joints, slick with river moisture, and narrow enough that my shoulders brushed the support beams on either side. Below, the Muskingum River moved with a black, oily slowness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The water was perhaps 15 feet down, close enough to hear individual currents lapping against the pilings, but too far to survive a fall without injury in the darkness. Elijah moved first, his small frame an advantage on the narrow walkway, his footing sure and quick. Lena followed 2 paces behind, one hand on the support beam to her left, the other gripping the Beretta. I brought up the rear with the Remington held across my body, barrel forward, trying not to think about the fact that firing a 12-gauge shotgun on a 3-foot-wide catwalk above a river at night would be roughly equivalent to announcing our position with a signal flare. The repeater tone continued its assault on the air above us, and through the gaps in the bridge deck, I could see the last stragglers of the cluster moving south, drawn by the sound. But not all of them. Through the steel grating of the deck above, silhouetted against the marginally lighter sky, I could see shapes that hadn't moved. 5, maybe 6, standing on the bridge itself, halfway across, facing south toward the sound, but not following. Stationary, evaluating. Second phase. They were resisting the stimulus. They were choosing not to follow. I tapped Lena's shoulder and pointed upward. She looked through the grating, and I saw her jaw tighten. She held up her hand, flat. Stop. We froze on the catwalk, 3 humans suspended between water and steel, while above us, evolved predators stood in the darkness and decided whether curiosity was worth more than vigilance. Time distorted. Each second expanded into a corridor of possibilities, each one ending in violence. The river sounds masked our breathing. The repeater tone masked our presence. But if one of the infected above looked down, if one of them possessed enough residual intelligence to check the underside of the structure they were standing on, the bridge would become a killing floor. Elijah did something extraordinary. Without being instructed, without looking back at either of us, he reached into his backpack and withdrew a small object, a wind-up toy, a plastic robot that walked and made clicking sounds when its mechanism was engaged. He wound it twice, set it on the catwalk grating, and released it. The toy walked forward along the grating, its small plastic feet producing a rhythmic tap-tap-tap that echoed off the water below and radiated upward through the bridge structure. The infected on the deck above shifted. Heads turned, not toward us, toward the toy, which was moving along the catwalk ahead of us. its sound profile small enough to be ambiguous, but directional enough to pull attention forward, away from our position. The figures above began to move. Not running, walking, or following the sound along the bridge deck in the direction the toy was traveling. They passed over our position without looking down. Their footsteps vibrated through the steel, each impact a reminder of how close they were, how thin the membrane of structure between their world and ours was. We moved. Fast now, sacrificing stealth for speed, while the toy's clicking drew the infected forward and the repeater tone drew the main cluster south. It was a symphony of misdirection, a 9-year-old's instinct providing the critical element that Marin's technology and our planning had missed. The far bank approached. I could see the catwalk terminating at the east piling, another ladder ascending to the road surface. Elijah reached it first and climbed without pausing, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency. Lena followed. I took one last look back along the catwalk. The wind-up toy had stopped halfway across, its mechanism exhausted, sitting silent on the steel grating. Above it, the infected had paused, gathered around the point where the sound had ceased, their heads tilting and turning as they searched for the stimulus that had led them there. I climbed the ladder. My hands shook. My legs trembled with the sustained adrenaline of the crossing. I pulled myself over the guardrail on the east bank and dropped to the ground beside Lena and Elijah, breathing in gasps that I couldn't control and didn't try to. "Move," Lena said. "Tree cover now." We sprinted from the bridge into a stand of mature oaks 50 yards from the road. Behind us, the repeater tone cut out abruptly. Marin had killed the signal. On the bridge, the infected that had followed the toy's sound were turning in slow circles, disoriented, their auditory anchor gone. On the riverbank to the south, the main cluster was beginning to fragment, individuals peeling away from the group and wandering in random directions as the signal's pull dissipated. We'd crossed. We were on the east bank of the Muskingum River, inside the operational radius of Lighthouse Station. And we were alive because a dead man's network, a scientist's ingenuity, and a child's backpack toy had conspired to create a 4-minute gap in the attention of 40 predators. I knelt in the leaves and looked at Elijah. "The robot, from your backpack?" He nodded. "My mom gave it to me, for the field trip. She said I'd need something to do on the bus." His voice cracked on the last word, the first fracture in his composure I'd witnessed, and then it sealed itself so quickly I almost doubted I'd heard it. Lena put her arm around him, not for comfort, but for stability. Hers. The radio crackled. Marin's voice, breathless. "I saw you on the cameras. You're clear. 2 miles southeast, follow the river path. Look for the blue reflectors on the trees. They'll lead you to my station. Hurry. The cluster is reorganizing." We ran. Lighthouse was built into the basement of a decommissioned river lockkeeper's house, a stone structure half hidden by overgrown vegetation at a point where the Muskingum bent sharply east. The blue reflectors Marin had described were small, discrete markers nailed to tree trunks at head height, visible only if you were looking for them, invisible to anything that processed the world through sound and scent, rather than color recognition. Marin met us at the reinforced basement entrance, a steel door set into the stone foundation, concealed behind a hinged section of wooden lattice. She was tall, angular, mid-50s, with close cropped gray hair and glasses that she pushed up her nose repeatedly in what I'd later recognize as a stress indicator rather than a practical adjustment. She ushered us inside without speaking, sealed the door, and engaged 3 separate locking mechanisms before turning to face us in the fluorescent light of her station. "Arthur always said the network would be tested," she said. "He didn't say it would be tested by a building inspector, a nurse, and a child." And an epidemiologist who lives alone in a basement, Lena replied. We're all improvising. The station was smaller than Arthur's shelter, but more specialized. Where Arthur had built for endurance, Marin had built for intelligence. Her workspace was dominated by monitoring equipment, not just radio, but data collection systems, recording devices, and a wall covered with handwritten charts, tracking infection progression rates, behavioral evolution timelines, and geographic spread patterns. She'd been doing science in the apocalypse, gathering data that might mean nothing or might mean everything, depending on whether anyone survived to use it. Sit down, eat. Then we talk about what comes next. We ate. Canned stew heated on a propane burner, protein bars, dried fruit. The food was unremarkable. The act of eating in a sealed space with another living human being who had been expecting us, who had prepared for our arrival, who had used her knowledge to help us cross a river of dead, was extraordinary. I realized I'd been holding my social breath for days, operating in a mode that treated every interaction as transactional, survival-oriented, stripped of the casual warmth that normally lubricated human contact. Marin's station, despite its clinical appearance, felt like something I hadn't experienced since before the outbreak. It felt like being received. Elijah fell asleep within minutes of eating, curled on a cot in the corner with his backpack and a thermal blanket. The crossing had exhausted him in ways that his composure had concealed. In sleep, his face finally registered the fear that his waking hours suppressed, his brow furrowed, his small hands clenched into fists, his body twitching with the micro-movements of dreams that replayed what daylight had forced him to endure. Lena watched him sleep. He's carrying more than any of us, she said, and he's carrying it better. Children are adaptive, Marin said. Their neural plasticity allows them to integrate traumatic experience faster than adults. It doesn't mean the cost is lower. It means the invoice arrives later. You sound like you've studied this. I studied infectious disease. But in the last 2 weeks, I've learned more about human behavior under pressure than any lab could teach. The infected aren't the only ones evolving. We are too. Every decision, every adaptation, every moment of cooperation or conflict reshapes our neural pathways just as the pathogen reshapes theirs. The difference is that we choose our evolution. They don't. Marin laid out her assessment of the broader situation. The outbreak, based on her data analysis, had now reached what she termed saturation phase across the Ohio Valley. The human population in a roughly 200-mile radius had been reduced to an estimated 3 to 5% of pre-outbreak levels. The military's quarantine perimeter had stabilized along a line she believed ran roughly from Pittsburgh to Louisville, with everything west of that line designated as a red zone, essentially abandoned to the infected. The good news, if there is any, is that the pathogen's reproductive cycle appears to be approaching a plateau. Infection rates are declining because there are fewer uninfected hosts to convert. The bad news is that the second phase infected now outnumber the first phase by approximately 2 to 1, and the behavioral adaptations are accelerating. Accelerating how? I asked. I've documented what I believe is a third phase, emerging in subjects approximately 10 to 14 days post-infection. Enhanced motor function persists, but cognitive indicators suggest partial recovery of prefrontal cortex activity, pattern recognition, tool use, and what I can only describe as social organization. The Sound Atlas reported, I said. The coordinated vocalizations. Yes, I believe third phase infected are developing a rudimentary communication system, not language, more like the alarm calls of social mammals, a set of vocalizations that convey basic information about threat, location, and group coordination. If this trend continues, within weeks we'll be facing an adversary that hunts in organized packs, communicates across distances, and adapts its tactics based on experience. The shelter's walls felt very thin. The stone and steel and concrete that separated us from the surface felt like a membrane rather than a barrier, permeable to the evolutionary pressure building outside. "So, what do we do?" Lena asked. Marin removed her glasses and cleaned them on her shirt, a gesture that somehow conveyed more vulnerability than anything she'd said. "We use the network. We gather who we can. We share intelligence. We find the military perimeter and we make contact. And we do it before the third phase matures, because after that, the calculus changes permanently." "How long?" I asked. "Best estimate? 3 weeks, maybe 4. After that, I don't think small groups survive on the surface. Not against coordinated pack hunters with rudimentary intelligence." 3 weeks. 21 days to cross hostile territory, locate a military line that might or might not accept civilian survivors, and do it with a nurse, a child, an epidemiologist, and a building inspector who'd never fired a weapon before last week. Arthur's notebook had said, "Live." I looked at my hands. They were steady. I looked at Lena, who was already planning. I looked at Elijah, sleeping with his fists clenched against dreams. I looked at Marin, who had chosen science over despair, who had stayed alone in a basement gathering data for a future she wasn't sure would exist. 3 weeks, I said. Then we move. Then we move, she agreed. Outside, the Muskingum River ran dark and indifferent. Above it, the dead continued their transformation. And beneath the stone walls of a lockkeeper's house, 4 people who had no business surviving began to plan their passage through the end of the world. Arthur Voss built a door in the ground and left it open for strangers. That single act, a code engraved on a steel frame, saved 3 lives on a rainy afternoon in Ohio. I think about him constantly now. A man I never met, sitting alone in a chair, watching cameras that showed a world he'd prepared for but couldn't endure alone. He died of a quiet heart in a loud apocalypse. And his final written word was, "Live." We stayed at Lighthouse for 11 days. Marin refined her data. Lena organized our medical and supply logistics. Elijah drew maps of every route we might take, his memory becoming our most valuable strategic asset. I maintained the radios, and on the 9th day, made contact with Ironside and Fort Wayne. 2 survivors, functional station, ready to move. The network held. Frayed, diminished, improvised beyond anything its architect had imagined, but operational. Arthur's design philosophy proved durable. Not a fortress, but a web. Not isolation, but connection. On the morning we left Lighthouse, heading east toward the perimeter, Elijah spoke without being asked. "Mister, Arthur's shelter is still there," he said. "Someone else might need it." He was right. The door in the ground remained sealed, powered, stocked, waiting. A seed in the earth for the next stranger who needed a reason to keep breathing. The code was 7714, and now you know it too.